Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on managing long-term sickness absence. We had such an amazing response to this webinar that it's clearly a topic that is very close to your hearts. In fact, we actually had to turn people away because we were fully subscribed. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I will be leading today's session. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Sue Watson, who is our HR Operations Manager. Hi, Sue.
Hello there, and hello everybody. I'm here to field any questions you might have during the presentation. If you've got any technical challenges, just let me know and I'll try and resolve them for you. And if you have any questions about managing absence, do send them through to us. If we have time at the end of the presentation, we will try and answer them then. If we don't, we'll try and answer what we can offline. So do send them through to us. And if you would like a copy of the slides, we're happy to send those through to you at the end of the presentation. Just send us an email and we'll sort that for you. Okay, I'll hand you back to Alison. Thank you.
Thank you. What I didn't say is she's also on standby. The is down, but she's probably praying that it doesn't. So let's carry on the session. So long-term sickness, why are we looking at this? Well, it was very encouraging to see that absence rates have now fallen to their lowest level since the records began. This is what the ONS tells us, and they report an average of just 4.3 per worker were lost to illness last year. Now that's an average per worker across the entire economy as a whole. We would expect employers who are working in smaller businesses, certainly those with less than 50, or employers working in professional services, for example, to have an absence rate that is actually lower than that. And of course, we also bear in mind that absence rates generally tend to be lower in the sector than the public sector. And the 4.3 days per worker is absence across the entire workforce. So the ONS report, which was called Sickness Absence in the Labour Market, suggested that a lack of job security was a significant factor in the decrease in absence. But it also said that the figures should be viewed in the context of the introduction of robust absence management procedures, and also the increase in people working from home when unwell, which is also something to bear in mind. So short-term absence seems to be under control, but long-term absence does remain a tricky area for many employers. And the longer an employee is absent, the harder it is to get them back to work. Also, many employers harbour genuine fears regarding possible discrimination, and they're particularly wary of absences due to stress. So a topic to be looked at anyway, but there were two other things that particularly prompted this webinar. One was a case which was very interesting. A lot of employers do fall foul of the need to follow a fair dismissal procedure once employees have been absent for a long period of time. And the case that I'm talking about is called O'Brien versus Bolton St. Catherine's Academy. And I will be saying more about it later on, but it does provide a useful reminder of the need to get up-to-date medical advice and to take it into consideration, even when, as in this case, the evidence wasn't presented until the appeal stage. So after the dismissal, it was presented at the appeal stage. And the other thing that this topic was a report that we read by the think tank IPPR, which looks at long-term sickness benefits. And the report was done for the government, and the IPPR recommended increasing the period for which SSP is paid up to a year. Now, SSP is currently paid for 28 weeks, so an increase to a year is quite a significant one, especially for smaller employers, because in the past, and we are going back a bit now, you used to be able to reclaim SSP if it was higher than a certain proportion of the national insurance payments that you were paying, but that's gone. So SSP now is totally funded by employers, irrespective of their size and irrespective of the amount of sick pay that they're actually paying. So an increase from 28 weeks to a year could hit smaller employers in particular very hard. Now, the report was also suggesting ways of making SSP more flexible and enabling it to better support employees to return to work. Because if employees return to work, then SSP stops. You can't have phased returns in the same way, and you can't have people coming for example, 2 or 3 days a week, because they would lose their SSP. So therefore, they're saying, look, let's make that scheme more flexible, because that could well help employers to in terms of rehabilitation, and thereby reduce the sickness absence rates. So we wait to see what happens on that front, but it was quite an interesting thing to see, and we suspect that an increase in SSP to a year would come as a very unwelcome shock to most smaller employers. So how should we deal with long-term sickness absence? And how do we set about getting the appropriate medical advice to make an informed decision? Well, of course, the case of long-term sickness absence is different, and it will depend on the circumstances of the person and the role that they do and the working environment in which they operate. But what is common to all cases is that time passes far more quickly than most of us realise, and absences can become ongoing before we notice them. And it is the case, and research has proven, that the longer employees are away from work and the less contact they have with their colleagues, the harder it becomes for them to return. And this can also lead to a further decline in their physical and mental health. Now, before we look at how to set about managing long-term sickness, let's just have a quick look at the legal considerations first of all. So firstly, legislation does permit the dismissal of an employee on grounds of capability. That's one of the 5 fair reasons for dismissal, and capability includes ill health. So all employees do have a contractual obligation to attend work consistently, and dismissal will occur if the employer is not able to tolerate the effect of the employee's absence any longer. Now, the amount of time that you can go before you dismiss anybody is going to be very dependent on the nature of the work the person does, how important their individual contribution is to the organisation, and how long you can actually cope without them. Yeah. And in cases of genuine ill health, it is clearly a last resort. And as with any dismissal, the essential test is whether the employer acted reasonably in treating the absence as a sufficient reason to dismiss. The ACAS Code of Practice does not apply to dismissals, so we don't need to concern ourselves with that, but we do need to concern ourselves with the Equality Act, because particular care does need to be taken with employees who are disabled. Basically, because first of all, if a case is brought against you for unfair dismissal of a disabled person, they are likely to also bring a case of disability discrimination, and the awards for disability discrimination, as you're probably all aware, are unlimited. There is no cap on those, and they can be very, very expensive for the simple reason that a lot of disabled people find it harder to find suitable alternative employment. So we need to take care with employees who are disabled because of the risks, but also to give proper consideration as to whether reasonable adjustments may enable the employee to return to work. Finally, just a little bit of legislation here. We have the Income Tax Amended Medical Treatment Regulations 2014. So came in a couple of years ago, and basically this was the government aiming to assist by making payments that are made for employer-funded medical treatment that has been recommended by the Fit for Work service to help an employee return to work. Well, it's made those exempt from tax and national insurance contributions up to the value of £500 per tax year. So that's the context in which we are looking at this particular subject. So what is long-term absence, first of all? I mean, you might think that that sounds self-evident, but actually there is no legal definition of long-term illness. And in smaller organisations, the absence may have much more of an immediate impact. So many small employers could regard anything in excess of, say, 4 weeks as being long-term. Larger employers may take a longer-term view. Despite this, what we do know is that stress, acute medical conditions, and mental ill health are the most common causes of longer-term absences. Now, persistent intermittent absence, people who are malingering, and unauthorised absence, all of those would normally be dealt with through your disciplinary procedure. So you would follow your process and you would give warnings when people are doing this. Long-term absence is different, so you would follow a different process, and it would normally be regarded as a capability issue. What we actually need before anything else is to have clear systems in place on all of this. So absence monitoring systems that actually alert you, first of all, once an employee has been absent for a pre-specified number of weeks. Now, you would determine that time scale. What is the trigger for you actually having a closer look at this particular absence? Yeah, it could well be 4 weeks, it may well be 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks. That is very much up to you, that trigger. Yeah, you also need a trigger before the employee runs out of either contractual or statutory sick pay to warn you of that. And if you have a permanent health insurance scheme, then you want a trigger that actually warns you when someone is about to become entitled to claim for that. So decide on the stages at which you feel an initial review is necessary, when you think you would want to take a medical report up, when you would follow up, for example, and then implement a system which automatically reminds you of these dates. And when you're designing this system, do note very common to experience delays, particularly in getting GP reports. So you may wish to consider taking action a little bit earlier than you originally thought so that any delay can be easily accommodated. And once you have this system in place, apply consistently and actively manage cases of long-term absence with the aim of getting the employee back to work as soon as possible, even if that's not at full capacity. So the first thing really is to stress the need to have good, open communications with your absent employees. Now, in some cases that we have come across, especially ones which are stress related, the medical advisors suggest limited communication with work to allow the person to recover free from interference or guilt. But that's pretty rare, and for most people, keeping in touch with the employee is going to help and will help them to focus on return to work plans and to keep that in their mind. For employees who are on long-term absence, returning will be a daunting prospect, and the longer it goes on, the more daunting it becomes. But if you can keep them up to date going on and inform them of any important changes within the business and generally show concern as to how they're getting on, then that's going to help reduce any feelings of hostility on their part and to assist them when they do finally return to work. So if this is something where you may not speak to the employees a lot yourself, ask the manager and the colleagues to those who are close to the person, who knows them very well. It's important that somebody keeps regular contact. It doesn't actually matter who it is that's doing that. Yeah? And throughout this process, make it clear to the employee what's happening, over what time frame, and agree in advance how they would like to be communicated with. They are off work ill, but they are expected to be available to take calls and to talk to you, but obviously not at the drop of a hat, because it may well be that people are having hospital appointments or checks or physiotherapy treatment and that sort of thing. So set out a time scale and agree what you're going to do, and ensure that the communication is regular enough to maintain the required levels of contact, but not so over the top that it becomes overbearing or invasive. I mean, for example, for somebody who has a severe medical condition where an imminent return is not likely, a monthly call will probably help be to keep you in regular contact. Others may prefer something a bit more frequent than that. So the first phone call you have, ask if it's okay to call regularly, find out how they like to be contacted with. So suggest an open door and that they contact you if there are any questions in the meantime. Now, the employee may well be sitting there fearing dismissal, Or alternatively, if they've exhausted their sick pay, they may be taking a bit of an ostrich approach and might feel relatively safe. And of course, there are also going to be cases where you doubt the validity of the continued absence. These ones need managing even more closely. So set an appropriate approach for each case and discuss it with the employee so that the expectations on both sides are clear. It's not just a case of sending in sick notes, and by the way, you do still need sick notes when people have exhausted statutory sick pay. Yeah? It's a case of finding out how they're getting on and when they think they may well be able to come back to work. So regular reviews, ongoing contact with the employee being fully informed of and procedures, and follow them consistently. What is very, very common where there is no sort of structured approach is that initially you have an awful lot of sympathy for somebody, that then turns to silence as everybody is getting on with the work and trying to cover for the absent employee, and then you get to the final straw stage and it turns into hounding and, well, when are you going to be back? That's not the best way of dealing with all of this. What we actually want is a robust but a consistent approach. So meetings with the employee, and in many cases for long-term sickness, a home visit is going to be appropriate and welcomed rather than expecting the employee to attend the workplace. If you do home visits, we would advise you always do take someone along with you, and also be prepared to find the employee's spouse or partner sitting in on any meetings. Now, if that's going to feel uncomfortable for you, then consider suggesting a suitable neutral alternative, such as a local hotel or meeting venue, because that might well be easier than expecting your absentee to attend the workplace or yours, if that's not the same, if that's going to be hard for them to get to. And when we're talking about proper consultation, what we're meaning by that is considering with the employee their opinion on their condition and how soon the employee's health and attendance may improve and when they think they're going to be able to return to work and on what basis. Looking at possible alternative employment in the meantime, or of a phased return to work, either with reduced hours or with different tasks if the person is not capable of doing the full role. And also a discussion with the employee regarding the possibility of seeking either further or independent medical opinion. And it's also very, very sensible to start discussions reasonably at a reasonable stage with the employees, to the stage when dismissal may be the outcome, rather than leaving it to the very final stage and then it comes as a shock. So I'm not meaning immediately for that, obviously, but if we're talking about repeat conversations, then at some point when you're starting to consider dismissal, it is worth ringing a few very gentle warning bells at that stage. So it's a case of managing expectations, basically. Now, the first step in managing long-term sickness would normally be to get specialist advice. Not from Sherlock Holmes, but that was the best picture I could find, actually. And also not usually from a private investigator either. But, you know, that's not unknown, where employees may appear to be malingering and employers have significant suspicions about whether they're actually as ill as they say they are. Usually what we're at here is a report from the employee's GP or consultant or from an occupational health advisor. Now, which do you do? In terms of a GP report, first of all, an employee may refuse permission for you to approach the GP. And any request to a GP or a consultant who is treating that person as their patient has to comply with the Access to Medical Reports Act 1988. Now, there are quite a number of inbuilt delays with this, in that the employee, first of all, can refuse permission. Yeah, but if they give permission for you to approach the GP, then they can ask to see the report before you do. They can also ask for changes to be made. So bear in mind that not only are GPs very busy and may well have priorities other than your medical report to deal with, but also there can be inbuilt delays in getting the report if your employee wants to see it first, and if they're asking for changes which possibly the GP may not agree with. So you could have a delay there. And the other thing about GP reports is bear in mind that the GPs are treating the individual. Your employee is the GP's patient, and the GP will usually believe what they're told by their patient. They're not going to visit your workplace and find out the nature of the job, yeah, and they will listen to what the patient tells them. Occupational health reports are slightly different in that they may be more objective because the employee is not the patient of the person preparing the report. So an occupational health specialist will advise the individual and the employer and will focus not on the treatment but on the nature of the work involved, which is not necessarily understood by the GPs, and they're going to be looking at achieving either a reasonable and sustainable return to work or an ill health dismissal. And a good occupational health specialist will actively assist you to find a solution rather than allowing things to drag on or to fester. Now, lots of contracts of employment include clauses that require employees, if requested, to undergo a medical examination. And failure to comply with this request could then be a breach of contract. But it is still common to try and get the employee's permission, especially because the occupational health specialist might, in some cases, want to consult with the GP or treating consultant. Some contracts specifically stipulate as well that if an employee fails to report for an occupational health assessment that they've scheduled, that they will withhold contractual sick pay from that time onwards. So whichever route you follow, always ensure that the employee is informed and involved and knows that you're making positive efforts to understand, first of all, the particular condition, how it presents itself, that individual, and what this means in relation to his or her work. Now, employees can refuse permission, as I said earlier, for medical report, but if they do, then you're going to have to make any decision on the basis of the information that's available to you at that time. So do make that clear to the employee in advance. The fact that you have requested and been refused specialist advice will always act in your favour. Failure to request this will, generally speaking, act against you. And that applies even if it is pretty obvious to you that the person is not going to be able to do their job. They're immobile and they cannot sit for long periods of time, and they're a long-distance lorry driver, for example. It may be obvious, but you still would benefit from the specialist advice. And even if the employee is saying to you, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to come back to work, so there's no point in you getting that medical report. If you have the specialist report, it's any dismissal that's based on the information that you've got from that is less likely to be challenged. And employees do change their minds, don't forget. Now, you will be required to meet the cost of either a GP or an occupational health report. And we see hugely varying reports that come out as a result of this in terms of the amount and the quality of advice. But basically, if you ask specific questions and include more tailored information, you're likely to get a more helpful response. So first of all, if the questions are phrased in a supportive way, which keeps the idea of returning to work alive, you're more likely to get a helpful response. You could include a copy of the job description, bearing in mind that the GP will not know very much about what that person does. But if the job description is primarily an office role, for example, and it's a great long list of tasks, then that's not going to be very helpful to the GP. What that person needs to know is the nature of the duties that the employee is required to undertake, and the working environment, if there are relevant factors. Now, we've even known, for example, employers send a short video showing the workplace or enclosed photographs of the workplace showing someone doing the job and the physical requirements, if it's a physical medical condition that we're talking about. If it's a mental condition, a stress-related condition, then they need to know in what circumstances the person's working, what the deadlines are, the sort of people that they're having to deal with if it's a customer-facing role. And ask what work, if any, the employee may be able to do. Because it might be that that employee can't return to their normal role, but they could well be able to undertake restricted duties for a temporary period until they're fully recovered. if you inform the medical advisor of what you're able to consider in terms of changes to tasks or working time, they can then advise accordingly, and you're far more likely to get some practical, specific suggestions which you can accommodate. Now, as another alternative to GP or occupational reports, there is also something called the Fit for Work survey. And this provides free independent occupational health advice for employees who've been absent for more than 4 consecutive weeks. Now, it will advise employees on overcoming barriers to a return to work, and it also provides case management. And the employees may be referred by their GP. Alternatively, employers may contact the service directly, but there are a few conditions. First of all, there has to be a reasonable likelihood that the employee is going to be able to return to work within 3 months. And the employee has to consent to referral. And the Fit for Work service also needs, first of all, the employee's consent to the assessment, but also the employee's consent to share the report with you and to contact you for further information. So the service can be used by employers and GPs, but if an employee fails to engage with it, then a GP will not issue any further fit notes. And also it's available for general work-related health advice, either online or via the telephone. Now, we don't have a lot of clients that have used it, so we haven't got an awful lot of information for you on this and on how effective it is. But what we have been told is, particularly if somebody has a disability, and there may be things like grants available to assist in the purchase of aids that will help them to do the job or get back to work, then the service actually is very, very good at referring you in those directions as well. But basically, it can't help to try it because it is free anyway, so give it a go. If an employee is lingering on this sort of thing, then actually just knowing that they're going to have an occupational health discussion with somebody may well be enough to trigger a return. In most long-term sickness cases, you're not talking about malingering, but clearly there are some cases where that does happen. Managing sick pay. Now, I said before that SSP normally runs for 28 weeks. It's 28 weeks in total, including any previous amounts of sick pay that have been paid in the 12 months. So ensure that your administrative systems give you an early prior warning when someone is going to run out of sick pay. Now, if your contractual sick pay scheme is very generous, the employee may not realise that they're coming to the end of this. And equally, with SSP, given the length of time that it's paid, the 28 weeks, that's a timescale that's easy to forget. And because of linked periods where SSP has been claimed in a previous absence, the employee may not be eligible for a full 28 weeks for the current period of absence. So do keep an eye on this. It's really good practice to warn the employee of any forthcoming reduction in pay. As I said before, in the case where employees are malingering, and being rather cynical here, this warning can bring about a sudden improvement in health and a swift return to work. But for those who are genuinely sick and who are running out of money altogether, the more notice you can give them in terms of adequate notice that they're going to be running out of sick pay, the better, because, what are they going to live on? If they're entitled to any statutory benefits, it's a good idea to advise them on how to set about checking entitlements to these and how to claim those. And the other reason for having your warning procedure is that it's very, very common to find that payroll hasn't been informed in time, and therefore employees are overpaid as a result. Now, if you do have overpayments like this, do treat these with caution. Clearly, yes, you are entitled to cover any overpayment. And you may well also have a clause in your contracts which allows you to deduct full repayment from the next available payment. But if somebody is on long-term sick and is running out of money and you have overpaid them for a while, then a sympathetic approach is far more likely to ensure a good relationship going forwards. So I'm not saying don't get the repayment, but a phased repayment over a long may be more appropriate than simply taking it out of any money that's owing to the employee. We have a lot of questions on our helpline about holiday whilst on sick leave. And what we do need to remember is that workers still accrue their full statutory annual holiday, i.e. 5.6 weeks, whilst they're absent on long-term sick leave. And they must be given the opportunity to take this, even if that person has exhausted his or her entitlement to sick pay, and even if the person does no work at all during that holiday year. So they will have accrued their full statutory 5.6 weeks. If they're unable to take that holiday during the leave year, then the basic 4 weeks holiday entitlement under EU law means that that 4 weeks should be carried forward into the next holiday year. Now, workers, and this is workers, not just employees, by the way, so workers as well, may request to take annual leave during a period of sickness absence, and they may choose to do that if they've run out of sick pay. So a worker, for example, can come off sick leave, take some paid holiday, and then go back onto sick leave. Now, you might think, oh my goodness, I don't want to be doing with all of that. But from an employer's point of view, actually, that can be quite a good solution, because it does have the benefit of preventing the employee from building up a lot of holiday, which they then carry forward into future years. So it can actually be easier for you to manage. And the case law at the moment is indicating that they should be allowed to carry forward their holiday for a period of up to 18 months. So if they're using that holiday and you're holiday at the appropriate, when they do come back to work, they're not going to have masses and masses of holiday to take. And it's a bit similar to things like maternity leave. When people come back from maternity leave, and if they come back on a part-time basis, for example, but they've accrued lots of holiday on a full-time basis, then that is an awful lot of holiday to take. So if they choose to take annual leave during a period of sickness, in very many cases, it's going to be sensible to let them do that. Now, that is their choice. You cannot enforce them taking their holidays during their period of sickness. Yeah. The other thing that you can't do as an employer is legally you cannot make a payment in lieu of the holiday unless the employee actually leaves your employment. And effectively, the same rules apply to people on sick leave in terms of booking and having authorised paid holiday as to anybody who's present in the workplace. So whatever your normal period is in terms of intention to take holiday, that would still apply unless you choose to have different arrangements for people who are on sick leave. And it's only on the termination of employment that the employee has the right to be paid for any accrued but untaken holiday entitlement. Now, disability. I mentioned before that we need to be extra cautious of cases which may develop into a disability. Disability could include anxiety and stress, which can lead to depression, but we should note that stress itself is not actually a medical condition. And alcoholism as well is not a disability, although you can have medical conditions that result from alcoholism, for example, liver problems, which could result in a disability. Now, who decides as to whether someone is disabled or not is quite interesting, because most employers would tend to think that it's going to be the GP or consultant that will tell them whether the person is disabled or not. But that actually is not the case. What case law states is that it's not up to the GP or consultant to decide. The person who decides whether an employee is disabled or not is the employer. And then an employment tribunal will then take its own view, which may or may not coincide with yours. Because of that, some people are saying, well, it's not worth asking the GP or consultant, what if we have to make the decision. But we would advise that you still do ask your advisor this question. Do you consider the person may be disabled? Because somebody who has specialist medical skills is actually far more likely to have an informed opinion on whether the patient falls within the statutory definition than you, because they're more likely to have a sensible view on the expected duration of the condition, which of course has to last for 12 months or more, and also whether it is going to affect that person's ability to undertake normal day-to-day activities. So ask the question because it's worth seeing what answers you get. And for disabled employees, before you make a decision to dismiss, then every effort should be made to make reasonable adjustments or to consider any alternative employment. Ultimately, fair dismissal is possible for a disabled employee, but if you have an employee who is disabled, follow the procedure meticulously, record everything to ensure you have a very clear trail of everything, and effectively dismissal is going to be the absolute last resort. On a slightly brighter tone, let's look at the ones who are going to be able to return to work after long-term sickness. Now, managing the return to work is pretty crucial because many of these are unsuccessful and they lead to prolonged absence or ongoing work difficulties. So first of all, it is worth really considering how hard it is for people who've been absent for a long time to return to work if they feel unsupported or cut off. If somebody's suffered from an accident or they have a serious health concerns, such as cancer or a heart attack, then a failure on your part to maintain regular communication and to plan a successful return to work can lead to them feeling pretty isolated. Employees who are deemed fit to work in some capacity are required to continue their employment if they are going to receive their full entitlement to the employment support allowance. So to enable this to happen for them, you may well need to make reasonable adjustments as well to support the employee's return to work. So what do we do? First of all, it may be that the employee can return on a phased basis, gradually increasing his or her hours or days until they're able to return to the normal contracted hours. You might want to look at adjustments to start or finish times or the number of days or additional breaks or longer breaks or shorter breaks. It may well be a case of looking at removing some of the normal duties of the role if these have contributed to the original reason for absence. Now, if somebody's coming back on a phased return, it is important to remember that their workload is going to have to be adjusted accordingly. There are so many cases of people returning to work on a part-time basis following a stress-related absence and finding that they face the same full-time workload and therefore the same problems as they did before going off sick. And then it's no surprise that the condition reoccurs, and the employer would be liable for this because the damage would be clearly foreseeable. So if you have somebody coming back on a phased return to work, set out the timescales very clearly so that both you and the employee know what's expected, confirm them in writing, monitor the return to work, and ensure that the workload correlates with the number of hours that that person is returning to work and that it's a reasonable workload for them to undertake. In some cases, we can be looking at very tricky cases, for example, where you have agoraphobia that's been triggered by an aggressive customer or fears about recovering from an operation which has been caused by a machine or a situation which injured the person. And it may well be that you're having to look at very, very high level advice such as cognitive behavioral therapy. And it could well be that time off for that sort of thing is therefore going to be critical to that individual. Now, if we're looking at these sort of things, time off for medical appointments, can't do the full range of the duties, can't do the full hours, then we're often asked whether the employees should be kept on full pay. Now, we would say use your judgment on this, depending on the circumstances and depending on the expected duration of the part-time arrangement. Your employee is only entitled to be paid for the hours that they can work. So if they can only work part-time hours, then only a part-time salary. And that may well be fine if they've exhausted their sick pay. But if they still have an entitlement full contractual sick pay, then reducing their pay to a part-time salary, which is less than they would get if they're on sick pay, is going to be a positive disincentive to them returning. So in which case you might want bit more flexible with your contractual sick pay scheme and possibly deduct the hours they work from their contractual sick pay entitlement. That then ekes out the contractual sick pay a little bit longer, but at least you're getting them back into the workplace and doing some work for you. And if the employee suggests permanent changes to the contract, i.e. a reduction in hours on an ongoing basis, then do consider these carefully to see whether they are practicable. Now, I'll talk about permanent health insurance very quickly because it may not apply to a lot of you. It's not common among smaller employers. But permanent health insurance basically are insurance policies that cover situations where the employee has of sick pay, they're unable to return, and it guarantees their income until such time as they can. Yeah. Now, where permanent health insurance policies are in place, we do need to be careful about the employment relationship. So first of all, ensure that you have an administrative system that prompts you to inform an employee shortly before they become entitled or may be entitled to PHI and give them the details of how to claim. But if you're considering potential dismissal, if you can't come back to work, then you do need to check the contracts and the policy because many PHI policies only cover those people who are still employees. So therefore, if you dismiss them, they would no longer be an employee and therefore be deprived of the benefits. So do check that. Remember that if they're employees, they will still accrue statutory leave and they will still retain their continuity of service, which is important in future dismissals. So it is worth discussing with your provider how you can organise for the employee to take holiday without losing the benefit of the permanent health insurance and having to start the claim afresh each time. And also note that any employees on permanent health insurance should continue to receive any contractual benefits they get. That's not just holiday, but includes things like company car and life assurance, for example, unless your contracts contain a cut-off point. We do have employers who've got employees on very, very long-term ill health situations who are getting permanent health insurance, and the fact that they are accruing holiday during that time and continuing with their benefits is a considerable expense. So it is worth looking at that. Now, if you are looking at dismissal, then basically we need to follow a fair process for this. And that is different to the process you would follow for short-term absences. Now, with short-term absences, what you would expect to see are a chain of formal warnings previously, but those are not going to be appropriate for someone who's been absent for a long time and who has a severe illness and who, whatever they do, and despite their best efforts, they are not going to be able to return to work. So warning them is only going to increase their stress effectively. But what you still need to do is to follow a fair process. And what this involves is, first of all, prior to considering dismissal, we would always advise you to request an up-to-date medical report unless the employee refuses permission for this. If the report indicates that the employee is unlikely to be able to return to their job in the near future, or if ever, and if you've consulted the employee following this, and you've looked and you're unable to find any alternative work, which is a practical alternative work for them, then you may well have to dismiss on grounds of ill health, and it would be fair. But what it's going to involve you doing is, first of all, inviting the employee to a meeting to discuss the situation. Now, the invitation should be made in writing so you have a clear audit trail on all of this and should set out the reasons for the meeting and the fact that you're considering bringing the employment to an end due to ill health. So the employee is under no doubt as to what this meeting is going to be. Yeah? Give them time to prepare for the meeting, to arrange for a companion to be present if they want. Now, we would recommend that you offer the opportunity to be accompanied by a colleague or a trade union representative. But in cases of ill health, you might even go a bit further than this. You could give the option of having a relative present, for example. You're not under any obligation to do that, but anything which helps put the employee at ease in a very difficult situation is going to be good. So also, in the case of an ill health meeting, yes, it's a formal dismissal meeting, possibly, if that's the outcome, but it may be advisable to hold that meeting at the employee's home, or again in a local neutral venue if your employee is unable to travel to you. Yeah. And at that time as well, note that a capability dismissal will normally be unfair benefit to pension scheme, and you don't take reasonable steps to find out whether the employee would be entitled to have an ill health retirement. Yeah, so don't deprive anybody of these if that may well be an option that's open to you. Now, at discuss the reasons for the potential dismissal and all of the options that you've explored to and avoid this, and allow the employee to have his or her say in full, yeah, and document all of this so you've got a very clear record of the meeting. You might want to provide details about benefits that the employee may entitled to, for the simple reason that if the employee is absolutely in agreement that they're not going to be able to return to work at all, then that gives the meeting a bit more purpose and a bit more supportive stance. Yeah. But if the employee is capable of doing some work, then it is important that you offer alternatives if it is available. So as in a phased return to work, you may have to consider making minor modifications to the job or to the work environment to facilitate the return to work. It could be, for example, something like a change of shifts to start off with. But what you don't have to do is to create a vacancy that is not there. If you have other vacancies, you would give somebody on long-term ill health priority over other candidates if they've got the required skill sets, but you don't have to create a job that didn't previously exist. What you do have to do, though, is to really consider the effect of the absence on your business, where the size of your business and the role that the person does and how easy it is to find cover for them, for example, is very important. To look at how similar situations have been handled in the past to ensure consistency, and also to look at whether the illness is a result of any disability, and in which case would reasonable adjustment. If you decide to dismiss an employee on the grounds of ill health, then write to confirm the decision and explain the reasons for this. And if you've consulted fully, you may well feel that giving the opportunity to appeal would be meaningless. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute anyway. Yeah. Now, if you're dismissing with notice, there are some funny rules that apply to this. It is slightly odd, yes, but an employee who is dismissed on grounds of ill health and who is unable to work out the notice period due to their sickness, well, if their contractual notice period is the same as the minimum statutory notice, then they must be paid full pay throughout the notice period. But if their contract gives them a notice period which is at least a week longer than the statutory minimum that would apply to them, then basically you should make the appropriate absence payments as normal. So there's no difference during the notice period. So effectively, if they're on SSP, they continue to be on SSP. If sick pay is exhausted, then in that instance, the notice period would be unpaid. You would, of course, pay in lieu of any accrued but untaken holiday, including any holiday that's been carried forwards from previous years. Now, there's no legal requirement to offer an appeal stage, and many employers consider that consulted fully and they've got an up-to-date medical report and they've got as much evidence as they possibly can, and the employee is saying, look, there's no way I'm going to be able to return to work, then there's very little to be gained from offering an appeal stage. But the case I mentioned earlier, O'Brien versus Bolton St. Catherine's Academy, is a useful reminder of the need to get up-to-date medical advice and to take it into consideration when it is presented to you, even if, as in this case, it's not presented until the appeal stage. Normally when we're looking at dismissal, we say, well, was that decision fair given the evidence and the information that the employer had at the dismissal? In this particular instance, yeah, the information came up at the appeal stage. So what we have is a teacher who went off sick with stress. And after a year's absence, the school tried to find out when she would be able to return and whether they could make any reasonable adjustments that might enable her to come back to work sooner. Now, Ms. O'Brien refused to meet with them because she thought it might upset her, but she did some information in writing, and she did let them contact her GP. And the GP wasn't sure when she'd be able to return to work. So the school therefore dismissed her, appealed to them that she wasn't going to be able to return to work in the near future. Surprisingly, possibly, she appealed. And at the appeal stage, she provided medical evidence from the GP that actually confirmed that she would be able to return to work imminently. Now, the school was very suspicious of the new evidence because it seemed to contradict the previous prognosis, and so it upheld the dismissal decision. So Ms. O'Brien therefore brought claims of discrimination arising from disability and also unfair dismissal, and she won, because the Court of Appeal found the dismissal was unfair because the employer had failed to take the new evidence provided at the appeal hearing into account. So it was quite sympathetic. It acknowledged that employers shouldn't have to wait forever for people to return, and it also accepted that absence could cause significant disruption. But it felt very strongly that once the school had received the new guidance, it should have obtained further medical evidence making a decision. We don't know what the award is going to be because the case was sent back to the Employment Tribunal to determine compensation. But it's an interesting case because it was a bit of a wake-up call, basically. Oh, excuse me. So, where do we start in all of them? You now know all of the background and what you need to do, but how to set about doing it. Well, first of all, if you do is essential, ensure it's clear and robust and that it does spell out your stance on absence. Look at absence records and the way you record these and ensure that they are comprehensive and accurate. If you ring our helpline to discuss a long-term absence case or somebody who's taken lots of repeated short-term absences, one of our first questions is going to be, well, when are they absent and how long have they been absent, and is there a pattern to it, and is there a consistent reason for the absence? So have comprehensive, accurate records. As I said earlier, put in place a system of triggers for absence monitoring, because this ensures that you're going to deal with all cases consistently, and it also does prompt you to take action in a timely manner. Consider having an occupational provider who gets to know you and your working environment, because they're going to be in a better position to give you practical advice on getting the person back. Keep in touch with your employees, as I said before, and always consider each case carefully and get a medical report before dismissing. So in summary, long-term absence has always been quite a delicate area of concern for employers, and getting it wrong can be very costly. It's even more costly now that we have accumulated holiday, which has to be carried forwards. So when dealing with people on long-term sick, review each case on an individual basis and do keep in contact regularly with the employee. Plan with them how and when to take their holiday entitlement so that it's not building. Consider a phased return to work if that's practical for the role and your working environment. It may not always be so, but if you can do, the sooner you will get that person back to work on any basis, it's going to be better than keeping them at home on sickness absence. Forget about these employees. Be able to show that you've done everything you can to keep in touch, to try to get them back to work. But if you are thinking about dismissing, then do always aim to get a medical report and consider whether you have any suitable alternative employment which you can offer, but you don't have to create a new role. If you're dismissed, such workers will be entitled to notice on full pay if they're only entitled to statutory notice, or less than 1 week more than this. Check out any insurance schemes before dismissing, and if you offer generous contractual holiday and you are concerned about holiday being carried over, then what you may well want to consider going forwards is some clause in the contracts which reduces holiday accrual to the statutory minimum during periods of long-term sick leave. But obviously that's just an option. So I think we've covered most areas of managing long-term sickness in the last hour. I am running out of time, I am aware of that, but Sue, were there any urgent queries that you think we should cover at this stage that will be of general relevance?
Hello, sorry about that. I was having trouble unmuting my microphone. We have had quite a few questions, and apologies to those of you who've had problems with the sound this afternoon. We will try and see what we can do about that for any future ones. But for those of you who stuck with us, thank you. We have had a number of questions. I've answered as many as I can during the afternoon, but we will come back directly to you, any that are outstanding. There are one or two that I just didn't get a chance to complete. So I think we will leave it there, if that's okay, Alison, and we'll come back to you directly.
Yes, I can breathe a sigh of relief in that case. That's end of the examination session for me. In that case, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this webinar and that you found it useful. As Sue said earlier, slides and a recording will be available shortly, so let us know if you'd like a copy. And next month's webinar will be on the 23rd of May, and that will be looking at employment status and the gig economy. So hopefully some of you will choose to join us for that as well. But in the meantime, have a good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us.